And just to remind everybody where we are. Thanks, Mary. I should have done both at the same time. So we left off last week with David got married a couple more times, and he married Abigail, whose husband mysteriously died after he was not a very nice person to David. He mysteriously died, and then Abigail married him. We read about, and he was already married to someone else by that point too, a woman named Ahinoam. We're going to hear about their families in a second, that he did indeed have kids with them. What's interesting about that is that we don't hear about those kids really later on. They're the kids that he has early. Well, I shouldn't say we don't hear about them at all. Those two ladies, their kids don't become as important. Some of the kids that we're going to read about that he has, the earlier kids, don't wind up being king. They actually don't wind up being alive either. But that's part of the dynastic struggles that you get in David's family and in other monarchies, obviously. The last thing we read was that David actually went off and joined our enemies. He joined the Philistines, and he fought with the Philistines because, he went to the Philistines because he wanted protection from Saul, because Saul kept chasing him, trying to kill him. And he realized the only safe place he could be would be with the Philistines. He winds up fighting with them as mercenary, but according to David, or at least according to the Bible, which probably went through David's redaction, he didn't kill Jews. He only killed other people. He didn't kill, for the Philistines, other Jews. And he would say he did, but he didn't really. And he'd kill everybody, so there wouldn't be anyone left alive to say who he killed. And that's what we left with. And the interesting thing is that as he's killing Jews, of course, what does that mean? The Philistine king Achish trusted David. He thought, he has aroused the wrath of his own people, Israel, so he will be my vassal forever. So he figures that as David is killing everybody from his own people, that David will never be able to go back to be king of Israel. Of course, again, what he doesn't know is that David's not really killing Israelites. And this is part of the deception that the Bible says is happening during this time. So we're going to pick up now in chapter 28, which is maybe the most famous chapter in Samuel after the David and Goliath story. So the story that happens here maybe is not the most read, because we read chapter 1 of Samuel every year at Rosh Hashanah when we read the birth of Samuel. We read about Samuel dying, and we don't get a lot of text about it. It just basically says he's dead. The people mourn. We're going to get a repetition of that in a second, because Samuel being dead is the critical part of this chapter. Samuel chapter 28, the return of Samuel. I'll leave it at that. Let Rosemary read and tell us this very spooky story, the return of Samuel.
At that time, the Philistines mustered their forces for war to take the field against Israel. Achish said to David, "You know, of course, that you and your men must march out with my forces." David answered Achish, "You surely know what your servant will do." In that case, Achish replied to David, "I will appoint you my bodyguard for life."
So the story begins with the Philistines, takes up with the Philistines. The Philistines are going to war with Israel in a pitched battle. This isn't like we're going out attacking a force or there's a little raid or something like that. This is an actual battlefield situation. So two armies lining up against each other. That's why it says they muster their forces to war, take the field against each other. So they're actually going into a battle with lots of soldiers, infantry, cavalry, whatever they had in the tanks in those days were chariots. It's that kind of battle. It's a big battle. David is now told by the king of the Philistines, "You know you have to fight with me." And David says, "Of course." course I'll fight with you. You know what I'll do. You know I'm going to. Now, at this moment, we don't know what David's thinking, because when David goes out on these raids for the Philistines, he can come back and say, oh, I killed everybody. Well, not this time, because it's going to happen right in front of the Philistines. What happens now? Well, I mean, what's David going to do? So what's he thinking at this moment? He says, I'm going to fight with you.
Now Samuel had died, and all Israel made lament for him, and he was buried in his own town of Ramah. And Saul had forbidden recourse to ghosts and familiar spirits in the land. The Philistines mustered, and they marched to Shunem and encamped. And Saul gathered all Israel, and they encamped at Gilboa.
Right. So those two verses, let's just take a look. Obviously, the important verse here, or one that we definitely have to take a look at, is this first one. Again, it reminds us that Samuel died. Except now we're not only told that Samuel had died and Israel made a lament for him, which is what we heard before, but we read this very critical line that Saul had made going to spirits and talking to necromancers made it illegal. Now, obviously, there's a reason why it's telling us that, right? Obviously, this is a there's a reason for this reminder, which it's not really a reminder. We haven't heard it yet. We haven't heard this. We hadn't heard this about Saul. Now, on the face of this looks really quite impressive that Saul had done this, that Saul had decided that people aren't going to be able to contact spirits. Seems like a pretty righteous thing to do as the Israelite king. We know that the Torah says you're not supposed to contact spirits. I mean, the Torah says you're not supposed to contact spirits. And it seems as though Saul's enforcing the Torah. Like nobody had done this before, maybe, again, maybe Saul's the first king or the first Jew. He is the first king, but he's the first person. None of the judges had done this. Nobody had actually ever done, what needed to be done, which is enforce this rule that you can't contact spirits. There's only, of course, one important problem that we know about him, which is that he does seem to have other gods. He has these teraphim that we heard about. So he does have idols, but he doesn't, maybe his big thing is contacting spirits. Maybe that's where he gets very traditional, very observant. But, on the face of it, all he's doing is he's enforcing Jewish law. So what did he do? He told people they can't contact spirits. So let me just for 1 second show where this battle is taking place, by the way, too. So up there on the screen, you can see where we are. It's not a great res on this. So you got the Philistines coming up on the red, and you have Saul's troops coming up on the green, and they're meeting up near Shunem in the Jezreel Valley. This is the valley that goes from Haifa up here down to Bet Shan on the Jordan. This is a very important valley connecting the coast with the Jordan Valley. This is the area where Megiddo is. Megiddo is right in this area, and the Jezreel Valley is right. Megiddo is right here. This area today is farmland, really beautiful farmland for Israel, for kibbutzim are all up and down this valley. Here's Shunem and Gilboa. They're right next to each other. Shunem is where the Philistines are, and Gilboa is where the Israelites are. Beth Shan is over here. We've been there before on our trips. And here's Endor, which are going to be all places that we're going to hear about coming up. So this war is taking place in the northern part of Israel. It's not down in Judah. It's not down in the area where we've been reading a lot about these wars, these battles, these confrontations that Saul and David have had, which have been out here by the Dead Sea and out down by Hebron and down here in the south. This is taking place about 50 miles to the north, 60 miles. That's all we're talking about. Back up here in the Galilee, the lower Galilee.
Where's Gilead?
So Gilead's over here.
Oh, okay.
Gilead is in modern day Golan Heights,
So these guys.
but they're not far from that area now.
Yeah.
Beth Shan right here, to remind people who've been on our Israel trips, Beth Shan became a Roman city. It's an amazingly well-preserved Roman city in Israel. It was called Scythopolis. And Scythopolis during the Roman era, the Judean period, during the time of Jesus, was primarily a Roman city. So it was laid out like a Roman city. The people who lived there were primarily pagan, though there were Jews that lived in Beth Shan during that time. But that's 1,000 years after this. Right now, we're talking about a time when this area was firmly in the north, far away from the Philistine territories, right? So the Philistines are going pretty far north to send a message to Israel, you're under our control. This isn't like a battle here. Remember, Philistia is down here. So going all the way up here is pretty much telling Israel, we can take any part of this country. It's all ours. So the Philistines are really, really, really far north.
Rabbi, why did they both travel? Usually
Yeah, right.
one group is in one place and you go
Right.
there.
So Saul's forces and Saul's hometown is right here, Gibeah in Judah. I mean, in Benjamin. This is Judah right here. And you've got Benjamin and then Ephraim, these tribes. This is the heartland. This is the main part of Israel during the time of King Saul and King David. Now, this area was definitely part of Israel, but it was part of the country that perhaps maybe the Philistines felt was good farmland. It was area that was important for the Philistines to exert control. But it's also important for Saul to exert control over that area. So, it doesn't say why the Philistines gathered there, why the forces were battling there. But again, for the Philistines, this is the far reaches of basically what they're saying is if the Philistines are in control of this, Saul has no power. If Saul can't control this area in the north, he's worthless. So Saul must be able to fight them here. And again, this is an area where there were a lot of battles, which is why Megiddo, right, is Armageddon. The final battle of all humanity was supposed to be fought in this valley because people, even again, during the time of Jesus, thought that this area was such an important, vital area to control from the south or the north. This you have to get through this place right here.
Weren't they trying to control? Was one trying to control access to cross the Jordan River at all? Is this?
It's not just literally. If you control this valley right here,
Yeah.
you basically control all of Israel. So if you're coming from the north, you got to get through this place, and if you're coming from the south, you have to get through this place. So the Jordan River was less vital than this valley. This valley was more of a border for armies than the Jordan River. So when people were going east to west, when they were crossing east to west, there were less confrontations in this area east to west than there were from north to south. Because the armies, let's say if you were from Syria and you were crossing in and battling people here, let's say Egypt, you had to get through this valley. Now this valley, all the way up through the Crusader period, 2,000 years later, Crusader period, there were still battles The last great Crusader battle was fought right over here. The Horns of Hittim were right there. So you control this area, you control all of Israel and essentially the gateway to Egypt.
Didn't they have like a secret password or shibboleth or shibboleth?
Yeah, the shibboleth, that was up here.
Yeah. So you,
That-
if you couldn't pronounce it.
Yeah, you couldn't
not
get
coming
through. But this area, interestingly, the east to west was less important than the north to south corridor. And mainly because from east to west, you're crossing through desert.
Yeah.
You're crossing through desert. If you cross this way, north to south, you're crossing through what's called the Fertile Crescent. So if you go across the north of Israel to the south of Israel or vice versa, on your way to Egypt, between those places, you're never in the desert. If you go this direction, eventually you're going to get to the desert. This doesn't do anything to you because you can't go that way.
So this is all farm?
Yeah, this is farmland in this area.
And that's what this was all about, was the farmland?
It's not just farmland, it's control of that region as essentially the bridge between Africa and or Egypt and Syria. So anyone who can control this valley controls that passageway. Because otherwise it's pretty flat the whole way down and it's pretty flat this way up. But right about here you get a valley, and this valley you got to come through. So again, the valley goes like this. The valley goes like this through here, where you see this river, which is not really a very big river, but it's, you know, it's a creek, a stream. But the valley.
What's that river called?
What?
What's that river called?
Jezreel?
Oh, Jezreel River?
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
So that's Haifa up here. That's Akko. This is a port, right? This is all port stuff. And then you're on your way. All right. So who's going to control this valley? This is the battle of the Philistines right now. So we'll stop that one and we'll go back to the text. What will happen in this crazy story? Not what you think.
The Philistines mustered and they marched to Shunem and encamped, and Saul gathered all Israel and they encamped at Gilboa. When Saul saw the Philistine force, his heart trembled with fear. And Saul inquired of the Lord, but the Lord did not answer him, either by dreams or by Urim or by prophets. Then Saul said to his courtiers, "Find me a woman who consults ghosts, so that I can go to her and inquire through her." And his courtiers told him that there was a woman in Endor who consulted ghosts.
Yep. So God's not talking to him, which doesn't surprise us because God said Samuel told him that God wouldn't be talking to him anymore. But Saul is really scared. That's what it said. Saul was scared. He saw the forces and he's thinking, this is it. I'm done. And God's not answering him. So what does he do? He says, I want to talk to a ghost. Of course, we know who he wants to talk to. And again,
That's Princess Leia in Endor, right?
Endor, right? But that's not the original Endor, right? The original Endor is Endora from
Yes.
Bewitched.
Bewitched, that's what I was thinking.
Endora was named after Endor,
Agnes Moorehead.
Agnes Moorehead. That's right, as Endora, the mother of Elizabeth Montgomery, Samantha. So Endor literally means the well or the spring. An ain, when we say ain, is a well, but a natural well, a spring. And door usually, has a connotation of generations, well or spring of the generations. And here's what happens with this visit.
Saul disguised himself. He put on different clothes and set out with two men. They came to the woman by night, and he said, "Please divine for me by a ghost. Bring up for me the one I shall name to you." But the woman answered him, "You know what Saul has done, how he has banned the use of ghosts and familiar spirits in the land. So why are you laying a trap for me to get me killed?"
Yeah, so what do we know? We know that Saul has said no more talking to ghosts. And now Saul himself is looking for someone to talk to a ghost. So the medium says to Saul, "You're tricking me. This is a trap. This is entrapment." Now, does she know that she's actually talking to Saul at this point? Well, he's in disguise. It says he's in disguise, by the way. It says he put on different kinds of clothes, but he's a pretty tall guy. You know, maybe people recognize him. Doesn't matter. She doesn't want to violate the law. She says, I don't want to get in trouble. You know, it's against the law. And it seems as though that against the law means you die, which is what the Torah does say is the punishment for consulting ghosts, being a medium, consulting ghosts. Now, I will tell you, Torah never says it doesn't work. Torah says you don't do it. That's not what we're supposed to do. And Saul basically just tells the woman, you know, call up the person that I tell you to call. I'm going to tell you who to get, and you get that person for me. She says, no, I'm not going to do it.
Saul swore to her by the Lord, as the Lord lives, you won't get into trouble over this. At that, the woman asked, whom shall I bring up for you? He answered, bring up Samuel for me.
So, does she know it's Saul? It's possible because he says you won't get in trouble if you do this. Now, the only one who can really guarantee that is Saul. Anybody else is has no authority to say that. But if she recognizes it's Saul at this point, then she's not worried about it because she can take his word for it. He's not going to kill her for doing this. Now, maybe she really thinks that it's Saul based on who he asked for, because he doesn't just ask for anyone. He asks for the most important person for generations, one of the most important Jews who ever lived, really since Moses. Bring up Samuel. So at this point, maybe she really, you could say, really is pretty sure that this is Saul. But listen, she's a medium. She could have known it was Saul right when he walked in. You know, she's a medium. She's a psychic. Well, it says she's a medium, but maybe she had that power too. So here's what happened.
Then the woman recognized Samuel, and she shrieked loudly and said to Saul, why have you deceived me? You are Saul. The king answered her, don't be afraid. What do you see? And the woman said to Saul, I see a divine being coming up from the earth.
Yeah. So let's just digest this for a second, because this is the only scene in the entire Bible. The only scene in the entire Bible where we see a ghost. This is the only place in the Bible up until this very moment. Only place from Genesis all the way into this very moment we're at right now. The only place where we ever have anything specific that tells us about what happens after we die.
It's hallucinating and it's in his dream.
Maybe, but the Bible seems pretty clear that this is Samuel. There doesn't seem to be any disagreement that what happens here is something mystical, something that wasn't supposed to happen, maybe.
The rise of Gilboa.
This is the first time that we've seen something like this happen. And one of the only times this is the only time we actually have a necromancer at work, seeing what they do. She freaks out. The woman freaks out when she sees Samuel. And she knows right away. Now she says, you are Saul. So is she shrieking because she's afraid? No, she's a medium. She sees ghosts all the time, assumedly. But she's really upset because she now knows 100% that she's talking to Saul. Whatever happened up until this point, now she's 100% sure that it's Saul. So now she's scared. Now she's saying to herself, you've tricked me. You're going to kill me now. You caught me. There also might be a little bit of fear on her part for who she disturbed. Because she just disturbed the most important guy, as I said, pretty much since Moses. She just disturbed Samuel. Now, when it says, interestingly enough, as we look at the Hebrew here, when Saul calms her down and says, don't be afraid, what do you see? She says, I see a divine being coming up from the earth. Now, what it does say here, if you read this with me, she said to Saul, Elohim ra'iti olim min haaretz, which literally can be read, and this is why they said it, I see God rising from the earth. Elohim, they translated here as divine being. But Elohim is the word for God. It is a plural word too, which makes it even more disturbing or complex, or the possibilities, because it also could be understood as divine beings, spirits, which is the way some people have translated or understood. I would say translated it, but I guess if they were not from Israel, Rashi or some of the commentators in Europe would have seen this and see the word Elohim and not wanting to translate it as God, say divine beings.
Yeah.
Meaning maybe Samuel wasn't by himself when he came up. There's a commentary that maybe he came up with Moses. And Moses came up with him. Somebody big, important comes up with him too. He's someone even bigger than him. Whatever happens here, however you're going to translate this word, how does it translate it there, by the way, Marion?
Gods
It says God came up?
with an S.
Gods. Oh, gods. Ooh, that's interesting. Gods.
If you weren't reading it that way, you say, oh, well, something's coming up from the earth. It's probably not some regular human here. So is it, an angel? But it actually says literally gods in this word.
So what are you going to do with this, this moment? We haven't gotten to the next line yet. Just at this moment, the woman's told him what she sees. So she's telling him what she sees happening.
What does he look like? He asked her. It is an old man coming up, she said, and he is wrapped in a robe. Then Saul knew that it was Samuel, and he bowed low in homage with his face to the ground.
So Saul believes that he is in the presence of Samuel at this point. Why? Because he sees an old man and he's wrapped in a robe. And again, with the robe, remember, he ripped Samuel's robe. Samuel had a robe every year that his mom would bring up to him, a new robe. Samuel's clothing is one of the distinctive things about Samuel. He had this robe that was him, that was part of who he was. So with the robe, wrapped in a robe, was kind of, Saul knows that it's really him. Clothes are important in this story too, because remember, Saul comes in disguise. He's wearing different clothes. And Samuel comes up and he's identified by his clothes. So clothes are an important theme in this story too. Like a lot of stories, that the clothes and disguises and these kinds of things are used as elements in these stories.
Well, Saul is still not all type of guess, because he's been having all these problems. I mean, would he interpret this differently? It's going, well, I got some demons and maybe this is another one.
So Don's saying is how does Saul interpret this, given his other issues, mental illness, darkness? I mean, the very fact that he wanted to do this is, indicative of his desperation. He went against his own rule, against his own law. So again, Saul winds up becoming essentially a victim of his own law. Yeah.
So let me just rewind for a second. So this is all happening because he's arrived at this battle, and does he know David's there?
He doesn't know David's
Does
here.
not know David's there. Okay, that's what.
Well, no.
Right, so he's just worried about the numbers in which he's.
Yeah, he's
and going into
panicking.
battle.
He's panicking about going into battle
Okay.
against the Philistines.
So everybody's over there waiting to fight, but he's gone over
Yeah,
here to talk.
He's going to find out whether God's going to give him victory. And so he's resorting, ironically, to the very thing that he outlawed. He's like, I'm out of choices. So he's backed himself into a corner. And now to get out of that, he tries to go to this medium. But he knows it's him. He knows he's in the presence of Samuel. Now watch what happens in the next scene.
Samuel said to Saul, "Why have you disturbed me and brought me up?" And Saul answered, "I am in great trouble. The Philistines are attacking me, and God has turned away from me. He no longer answers me, either by prophets or in dreams. So I have called you to tell me what I am to do." Samuel said, "Why do you ask me, seeing that the Lord has turned away from you and has become your adversary?"
So what's interesting about this, something's happened in this scene that you might not have even caught. And again, there's different ways you can interpret it, and there's different ways you can play it out in your head. But up until this scene, Saul is hearing about the Spirit from the medium. At the beginning of this verse, right? Saul's asking her, what do you see? What do you see? Now, Samuel and Saul are conversing back and forth to each other.
But through her.
I don't know. Can he see the Spirit now? Is Samuel manifested, somehow? I don't know. What happened? What happened in this moment? Is he talking through the woman? Did the Spirit come through her now? Is she speaking? Can he see the Spirit now? But he's talking now. Samuel and Saul are now having a conversation. And Samuel's first question is, why have you disturbed me and brought me up? Now, I don't know what to tell you about that line right there, because I already told you, and trust me when I tell you this, there is not one word about what happens after we die until this very moment. We know people are buried, right? We read about Abraham being buried and all the patriarchs and matriarchs being buried, and we read about Moses being buried and Aaron and Miriam, they're all buried. People are buried. Burial, by the way, implies to some extent the belief in something happening to us after we go, in the sense that the way we bury somebody, the way we lay people to rest and allow them to return back, become part of whatever transition you want to say. One of the most important ways of anthropologists understanding cultures that they uncover through, when they dig up, especially through archaeology and digging up sites, is they understand what people believed about the afterlife and what their belief system was by the way they bury people. We read that Samuel's buried. We read about the fact that people were sad when he died. Now we have Samuel coming back. So when Samuel comes back, he's not happy. The Bible tells us he's not happy about being disturbed. He also says, bring me up, which seems to imply he's down below. I'm only giving you these things because that's what we have. And rather than speculate and tell you what I'm not 100% sure of, all we have to go by is the archaeology, the text, maybe some guesses.
It really is.
But that's it. Yeah, so there's archaeology from this period. So we have Bronze Age sites in Israel where we excavated and know this is what people who lived in the land of Israel. We're not 100% sure they're Israelite necessarily always, but there's things we can kind of guess. We actually kind of guess when we see Jewish tombs, Israelite tombs that are not filled with a lot of material, because almost all the other cultures buried their people with stuff. The Israelites didn't do that because we seem to not believe that you needed that stuff in the next world. But this is all we have. I mean, honestly, it's really hard for us to tell people what do Jews believe about the afterlife other than looking at chapter 28 of Samuel and saying, well, what do we know? There's a spirit. The spirit can be summoned. It seems like it comes up out of the ground. Doesn't seem to want to be, at least this spirit doesn't want to be disturbed. There seems to be some sense of it being divine. All of these are things that we can see in the text. And it either says so or it seems by the language that that's what's happening. That's all we have. So when people say, what did the people in the biblical period believe about life after death? Folks, this chapter is about all we've got. Everything else is us, our ancestors who lived after these people, 1,000 years after. Remember, this is 1,000 years before Christianity, Rabbinic Judaism, the Talmud. This is 1,000 years before that. So when people in the Talmud talk about life after death and spirits and things like that, they're talking about it from their period. We're now 3,000 years after this. So, and the things that we talk about, or we imagine that that's thousands of years of history and literature and other cultures and other mythologies and everything else being laid on it. This is all we've got.
Is it possible that they were buried without a lot of stuff because of the way they traveled? They were nomads, right?
Yeah, but by this period, right? You're right. There were a lot of them were nomadic. They had sheep, they had goats, those kind of things. But by the time of King David and King Saul, they had cities, right? They have cities that they're living in. They're offering sacrifices in certain places. They're not just necessarily only in just always living in tents. Some of these people lived in cities. They're transitioning. That definitely, you're right though, Marcia, it makes a difference when you're a city person versus someone who lives out in the fields, what you're going to be buried with.
What about like all the idols and stuff like that? That's already passed. Do they still have their idols?
Oh no, they're still Jews. There's still people who have idols, but it doesn't seem necessarily to be, it doesn't mean we don't see idols buried with people. So if you're going to go that direction, it's not really, that's not what we find. We found idols. We don't find them in burial sites. We do find warnings, by the way, occasionally. We found some ancient burial sites that basically said, don't disturb this place. So there's an understanding that somehow, spirits and bodies and things like that shouldn't be disturbed.
Which would lead back to this.
Yeah. So this is what we got. Now, of course, we focus on the story, the narrative, which basically, again, it's pretty straightforward. Samuel tells Saul, what did you expect? God's turned away from you. What did you think? We were joking when we told you that God had left you? No, this is exactly what I've been telling you for years, actually, that you're done. You're done. We've been telling you this. So that's not really a surprise. Definitely seems to be reaching ahead, a critical moment, which it sure is. Anybody else have any thoughts or anything about anything about this? I will tell you that part of what goes into the equation of discussing what happens here in this scene is that, look, there's a recognition that if anybody deserved to have a pleasant afterlife, it's this guy, Samuel, which means, number one, he shouldn't be disturbed having to come back into this world. Okay. So that's already, this is just further Saul aggravating Samuel. Like, you've aggravated me for years, and now you did this. I can't even have a pleasant death. My afterlife gets disturbed by you.
What is the period of time involved here? How long has Samuel been busy?
How long has Samuel been gone for? It's a good question. It doesn't exactly say how long he's been gone for, right? It doesn't seem like it's a very long time. It seems like maybe it's a year, less than a year. It has not been long.
Right, we read about it earlier.
Yes, which, again, and I don't want to dwell on this other than like what's really happening in this scene. So Samuel, we assume, is about as good of a person as you can get. The guy is a prophet, he's a judge, he's a leader, he's a priest to some extent for the people. He does everything. He's kind of one of the most important leaders who've said since Moses. So we kind of assume that if there's anybody going to heaven, it's this guy. Anybody who's have a pleasant afterlife, it's this guy. But there is this possibility that as he maybe was only recently deceased, that his body still hasn't completely crossed over into the next world, which is why he can still be brought back. So if he's in that middle period of kind of being in limbo, then that first year, and maybe, and again, the whole reason for a year is that, like, when we come to the end of at the end of the Shana, at the end of the year, the first year, the assumption is even the person who's kind of like, didn't quite have their act together, after a year of being in this Gehenna period, of being in purgatory or being in this not in your final stop, after a year, everybody gets through. But somebody who's like really righteous, maybe they only need a couple days in Gehenna. And the whole reason we're supposed to say Kaddish every day during that time is that we elevate those people, we keep them in our minds, we keep them protected, if you will, while they're in Gehenna. By remembering them and saying Kaddish for them, we help elevate them and get them to that next stop. So if he's in that middle period, then it kind of makes sense that he can still be brought back. But all of this is speculation. All of this is that's where we start getting into like our beliefs 1,000 years ago or 2,000 years ago. It's really problematic because we really don't have a lot.
So was Gehenna like purgatory?
Yeah. Yeah. So if Gehenna is like a purgatory where we have to get cleansed out of our worldly desires and our worldly problems, we get to the next step through purgatory, through Gehenna, that, we're more of a pure essence by that point. But those are ideas that start crystallizing during the Persian period and the Greek period, Roman period. We don't know exactly what people were thinking, and when this was written, what the context really was for them. So for us to say it and for us to apply that stuff, for us to say it's Gehenna, whatever, that's what the rabbi said. They had no issue saying that about Samuel. But all of this is again, to some extent, our beliefs and our own development on what happens after we die. Though it does seem, based on this, there is something after we die. There is some spirit that continues on after we go.
Were the Egyptians a strong influence at this point?
They would be an influence, right, Gail? But the question of whether they were influencing people to be more prone to their views, or were they more prone to Eastern things from Babylonia and from Sumeria, from that culture, which seems to be more predominant on us than the Egyptian views of the afterlife. We don't see too much in this period that is Egyptian, similar to the Egyptian views of the afterlife. So it doesn't seem like that had as much cultural influence as the more Eastern side. But again, we don't know even if that's what's at play here, because the Bible gives us a very, very rudimentary view of what happens. He doesn't say it's a good place he's at. He definitely doesn't seem to be happy being disturbed, though. I mean, he uses the word, why did you disturb me? Why is this? Why are you, why are you, I mean, disturbed is a good word. Is that what your translation is? Disquieted is a good one, but disquieted, yeah, I mean, both of them are not good. Both of them are, you are shaking me up.
Yeah, but they didn't believe this, sorry, what was the term?
Gehenna.
But they didn't believe this was any physical. I mean, I'm just thinking if it was anything adopted from the Egyptians, they were really made a whole thing out of preparing people for the dead with the attunement. So do they even consider this as some kind of a physical or, a place, or is it just kind of a mindset of what someone went through when they were transitioning?
Look, well, so later on, by the time we get Gehenna, it does seem to be more of, other views, not necessarily Egyptian stuff. There's very little that seems Egyptian influence in the development of Jewish beliefs about afterlife. Very little seems to have come from Egypt. There is this understanding that there's a soul and a spirit, that there's 3 levels, 3 dimensions to the spirit, which exists in the Egyptian beliefs about when you die. And there seems to be multi-levels to the soul. Look, there are definitely people who could take an Egyptian view of the afterlife here with Samuel and say that this is only one aspect of his spirit, that this is a spirit that is like your ghost, which is different than your highest spirit, which is more in line with what the Egyptians believed. It's 100% possible.
I just read that there were more Egyptian artifacts or more Egyptian, they had a stronger influence than we had thought, but I just don't know whether it was this time period or later.
No, we're finding stuff that we know is that was from this period, but it wasn't necessarily so we just don't have death rituals that are similar to this. So this is just so you can see, this is the Egyptian belief of the different levels of spirit, the soul, was the Ka, the Ba, Ach. And there are people.
Rabbi,
Yes.
I have a book that I've read by Simcha Paul Raphael about the Jewish views of the afterlife on the different levels. It's a very good book if anybody wants to read it.
Yeah, and what he did in his book is he traced the different influences of
I actually met him. He was in Sedona on a tour when I bought his book. Very nice
I
gentleman.
remember you told me that you actually saw
Yeah.
it, you autographed it or
Yeah.
well, I think he talks about this a little bit, but there doesn't seem to be a huge influence of Egyptian, but there are people who believe that the different levels that we have, or the different words we have in Hebrew for soul, reflect these different aspects of the soul, or different ways the soul can be perceived. So the ka, the ba, and the ach, and it's kind of like, we have words in Hebrew for nefesh, neshama, ruach. We have different words for these things. Is it possible that these different things also represent different aspects of a soul? It's possible. The rabbis do, later on talk about these different aspects and prioritize them, if you will, so that you have a ruach, which is the basic element of animation or breath, if you will. Then you have a nefesh, which is your vital life force, which question of whether that has a consciousness, and then your neshama, which is actually your consciousness, kind of the part of you that would your soul, if you will. So we have similar, whether that was Egyptian influence or did that come from somewhere else, it's possible. But yeah, the Egyptians did talk about these different things that someone would perceive. So is that what's going on here? It's possible. But this essence, or this spirit that is manifesting itself now, is having a conversation with King Saul. And that's the important thing right now, is they're actually having a conversation. They're actually discussing what's going on. And the spirit at least can go back and forth with him. Because he says, why have you disturbed me? Saul says why he's disturbed him. And Samuel responds. So it's not just the spirit speaking what the spirit wants to say. Whatever Samuel was going to say, he said it right away. Why'd you disturb me? But it's not like the spirit is just speaking. The spirit's in conversation, which means the spirit is able to process and then respond to the question. It's not like the spirit is just speaking. This just said they're having a dialogue. Okay.
The Lord has done for himself as he foretold through me. The Lord has torn the kingship out of your hands and has given it to your fellow, to David, because you did not obey the Lord and did not execute his wrath upon the Amalekites. That is why the Lord has done this to you today. Further, the Lord will deliver the Israelites who are with you into the hands of the Philistines. Tomorrow, your sons and you will be with me, and the Lord will also deliver the Israelite forces into the hands of the Philistines.
Okay, so you all see what just happened there, which is the spirit's now reminded Saul that this was all foretold. We told you this. We've told you this. We told you why it's happening, because you didn't listen to me and you didn't kill the Amalekites like I told you, like God told you to. We've told you this. This is why this is happening. You know why it's happening. And here specifically, Samuel tells him it's going to David. Now, Saul knew this all along, or not necessarily all along, but suspected it. Then he even told David, we saw last week, you're going to be king one day. Just remember, don't kill me, my family, right? Well, Samuel just told him something real important, which is, you don't have to worry about that, Saul, because they're all dying too.
Yeah.
And he says it in such a powerful way. He doesn't just say they're dying. says, you're all going to be with me.
So to deliver the Israelites means they will be prisoners? Right, deliver the Israelites to the hand of the Philistines?
Yeah, they'll be prisoners, or they'll be dead.
Yeah.
They're going to be conquered.
Yeah.
Tomorrow, you guys are all dead.
Okay.
And he says it in such a powerful way, right? He doesn't just say, tomorrow your sons and you will be dead. You'll be with me. So wherever he is, whatever that means, that's where they'll be. Which, by the way, is a little problematic if you think about it. Because the fact that they're all going to the same place, Saul's, I mean, maybe he does some good things, but the fact that Samuel and Saul are both in the same place, going to be in the same place,
So maybe that's when Samuel's elevated out of there.
maybe, but the fact that they're going to be going to the same place seems to imply, at least partially, that they're, I mean, you could say he's saying it in a more generic way, which is we'll all be dead. But the idea here that they could possibly be in the same place may indicate, again, this idea that we might be having here, which is that there's not necessarily a good place and a bad place. That the next place might be, yeah, but the good place, as we found out, wasn't really the good place. So this is a weird idea, which is that maybe they're not going to a place that is necessarily really good right away. Now, again, how people read this and how people make sense of this it says a lot about what their belief system is now or when they've read it. But I will tell you that everybody who reads this, except for people who just completely deny that there's something that happens after we die completely, which I guess you could say, like Marcia said, this is all in their minds. They're not really, but there's nothing in here, by the way, that implies that at all, that this is not really happening.
But can it also be that the physical body is in one situation, your mind and spirit? I mean, that's my experience from what I've read, seen, done, that there's a separation just right about at that time, right? Now you're talking about a physical mind versus a spiritual.
Yeah. However, again, the way people read this, they usually make it fit into what their belief system is, right? So I could tell you that people who are, so we actually, she's living with us again. We have Glynis living with us again. And Glynis has been part of our family on and off for 22 years. Glynis is a Seventh-day Adventist, and Seventh-day Adventists believe that after you die, you go to sleep. And you go to sleep until Jesus comes back and everyone gets resurrected. So it kind of answers part of what the question is what happens now? What happens after you die? Well, nothing really. There's no heaven. You don't all get to be in heaven, but you go to sleep. And when there's a resurrection and everyone gets resurrected, then you'll be judged and then you'll go one place or the other. So for Seventh-day Adventists, there's a hold off period until that resurrection.
Another resurrection.
The resurrection when Jesus comes back. Now, Judaism has some similar ideas to that when it comes to the end of the world or the end, was that eventually spirits will be returned back to their bodies at the time when the Messiah comes. So if the Messiah comes back and returns everybody's bodies to their spirits, or with God, Messiah doesn't do it by himself, God does it, then everyone's bodies and spirits can be resurrected, which again, Seventh-day Adventists and other Christian denominations, are believing the same thing.
So
But if
it's just a holding pattern, like your passport.
Francine got here just in time as we're talking about what happens after we die. But this is the text where again, where there seems to be at least an understanding that when Saul and his family die, they're not necessarily going to a better place. Now, I say not necessarily because maybe, again, Samuel is talking about it in the generic form, which is that you'll be on the other side. Maybe Samuel is in a different existence than Saul, and it's just his way of saying you're going to be dead in a very poetic way. But it's also possible that, again, there really are, the differences are minor after we die between someone like Samuel and someone like Saul.
Are there midrash stories of this?
There's a lot of commentary on this. The commentary on this, though, focuses on interesting things, which would not necessarily be the ones that you and I would find helpful. So the discussion of, for example, of how, I'll show you one such commentary. One of the commentaries is how does she know that it's how does she know that it's Samuel? She screamed loudly, for when she saw him ascending, not in the usual manner of those who descend, but when a medium conjures up one who's dead, they ascend with their feet upward, while this one ascending his head upward in honor of Saul. Well, this gets to the fact that the spirit came up in a different way because King Saul was there. There's another understanding, another midrash, that it's Samuel comes up head first because he's Samuel and because he's not like other people. But they focus more on the way he comes up rather than on see if there's anything else I can put up in English. No, but this is the same one about coming up with your feet upwards. That's Radak. That's Kimchi, Rabbi David Kimchi, who's from the Middle Ages. See if there's anything else in English. Nope.
An interesting concept.
Yeah, so they focus on the way people come up out of the ground more than anything else. Let's just see if there's anything else. Yeah, here's Rashi's. I saw a godly man coming up, which is the Elohim, two angels, Moshe and Samuel. For Shmuel feared, perhaps I'm being summoned for judgment, and he therefore brought Moshe up with him. And that's from the Talmud. So that gets to the point that Samuel is worried that his time in purgatory is up, which is why he got called up. So that, again, that's based on the Talmudic texts about this. The Talmud does talk about ghosts. Not a lot. There's not a lot. I don't want to make it seem like there's a lot. There's not. There's a handful of places. I've actually brought in the texts a long time ago that talk about it. There are a few texts that talk about ghosts, and ghosts do have the ability to see things that are going on that we can't see. That's one of the things the Talmud definitely tells us, that ghosts have the ability to kind of go back between the worlds. There does seem to be a time when the body or the spirit is hovering or by the body more than later on. It seems like after a certain period of time, the spirit is not near the bodies anymore. But one of the reasons why you don't spend time in cemeteries at night is because there are still spirits that hover by their bodies, or either the assumption is that they have a hard time releasing from their bodies, like Ghost, like the movie. But look, I mean, these are all ideas that kind of develop over time. Sometimes it's hard to know when these ideas developed, or at least by the time that people say that these things, it could be hundreds of years later, like the Talmud, which was hundreds of years after the story took place. But it's a really important story because, as I said, it gives us a little bit of view of what our ancestors believed 3,000 years ago when it came to the afterlife. So those are all some little commentaries on it. But the other commentaries are kind of based on those commentaries. So That seems to be the focus. The focus isn't on what you'd like to know, which is what happened. What happens next? You know, what did happen to Samuel after he died? All we know, again, is he doesn't seem to want to be brought up. He doesn't give Saul any words of comfort. On the contrary, he basically says it's all over for you. David is going to take over. Your family's all going to die. And it's really bad. It's the way everything you wouldn't want to have happen. And here's what happens.
At once, Saul flung himself prone on the ground, terrified by Samuel's words. Besides, there was no strength in him, for he had not eaten anything all day and all night. The woman went up to Saul, and seeing how greatly disturbed he was, she said to him, "Your handmaid listened to you. I took my life in my hands and heeded the request you made of me. So now you listen to me. Let me set before you a bit of food. Eat, and then you will have the strength to go on your way."
Wow. So this medium, this lady, the witch of Endor, it's pretty nice, right? And she says, yeah, eat. You got to have a little food. She's a typical Jewish mother, right? You got to eat something. Look, listen to me. I took my life and, I risked my life for helping you. Let me help you a little bit. So she seems like a really nice lady. She basically says, eat a little bit. And you can see Saul's having a really, really bad time, right? He hasn't eaten. He hasn't, he looks upset. He looks disheveled. He's upside down. And that's essentially, the way she sees him. So she says, eat a little bit. And what does he do?
He refused, saying, "I will not eat." But when his courtiers, as well as the woman, urged him, he listened to them. He got up from the ground and sat on the bed. The woman had a stall-fed calf in the house. She hastily slaughtered it and took flour and kneaded it and baked some unleavened cakes. She set this before Saul and his courtiers, and they ate. Then they rose and left the same night.
So they left after they did finally eat. Everyone talked him into it. The guys talked him into it too. He eats.
To be unleavened, is that an indicator that we're?
Matzah. No, I mean that matzot are used other times, right? So matzot are used in they're used in the sacrifices too. We read about matzot that are baked. So this doesn't have to be Passover, but it does make us think about Passover.
So, and I may be totally wrong when I'm going to say past you here. So Passover itself, it takes on, like, I know that we went Christmas Eve one year and they did the story of Passover, right? I think I might have been.
Right.
Seems that odd that you would need the flour if you're not going to let the bread rise.
That's true. Yeah, I'm going to probably do this.
Okay. So what happens here in this scene is that he has his last meal.
Okay, so that's maybe.
This is his last meal.
But isn't that symbolic to Passover and all of them sitting together?
Could be. And this is Saul's last supper. Saul's last supper is here with the witch at the witch's house, which, look, he knows it's his last supper. He's been told tomorrow you're going to be dead. So when you're told that you're going to be dead the next day, at some point, his fear, the terror of this moment just becomes the reality. I'm going to go and I'm going to die. And he knows he's going to die. That's why it really is a lot like a last meal. Now, again, it's interesting because in the Christian story, Jesus knows he's going to die. And of course, he's not dying in battle. He seems to want to go. It's not the same thing, but Saul is also basically being told that his family's all going to be killed too, which means that his whole dynasty is over. It's not quite over as fast as this, though. Unfortunately, as we're going to see, it's much bloodier than that. But this is now where we're going to finish today, the Battle of Gilboa.
The Philistines mustered all their forces at Aphek, while Israel was encamping at the spring in Jezreel. The Philistine lords came marching, each with his units of hundreds and of thousands. And David and his men came marching last with Achish.
So David is in battle with the Philistines. That's what it says. They're marching in. And each one of the Philistine lords, and assuming there was, again, the 5 main cities of the Philistines, Gaza, Gath, Ekron, etc., Ashkelon, all these places are coming to battle. And he's with King Achish of Gath. That's what it says.
The Philistine officers asked, "Who are those Hebrews?" "Why, that's David, the servant of King Saul of Israel," Achish answered the Philistine officers. "He has been with me for a year or more, and I have found no fault in him from the day he defected until now."
Uh-huh.
So he knew that.
Who knew?
Achish knew that David.
Oh, yeah.
was a Jew.
Oh, yeah. He came over to him and told him, "I'm glad you're here, because now you'll fight for me and you can't go anywhere else. You're going to be mine now. No one's going to want you. I get to, I'm going to control you." He doesn't say that. He thinks that, but David's using him and he's using David.
Right.
But this is where he's at right now. So the other Philistines say to Achish, "What are you doing with this guy? He works for Saul." He goes, he defected. He's on my side now. He's on our side. He's good. Trust me. I've seen him for a year. Now, as we know, according to the Bible, David is really not fighting for Achish. He is, but he's not killing other Israelites. So Achish is kind of misled. He's been deceived that David is a legitimate fighter for him. But let's see what he says to the people, the other Philistines.
But the Philistine officers were angry with him, and the Philistine officers said to him, "Send the man back. Let him go back to the place you assigned him. He shall not march down with us to the battle, or else he may become our adversary in battle. For with what could that fellow appease his master, if not with the heads of these men? Remember, he is the David of whom they sang as they danced. Saul has slain his thousands, David his tens of thousands."
Yeah, and those tens of thousands were us Philistines. Do you remember? David is the killer of Philistines. He's been killing Philistines back since Goliath. And now you're trusting this guy? Send him away. Get him off the battlefield. And they say flat out, because if they're going to start fighting against us, they'll kill us from inside. This is a setup. Get this guy out. Get him out. So it's a wonderful scene, because you can see the back and forth that's going on here between the Philistines and within the Philistines with regards to what to do with David. Now, David doesn't seem to have a lot to do in this scene. It's not really, he doesn't really get to say anything. Nobody ever said, "Hey, David, come over here. You going to fight with us?" That doesn't happen. Doesn't matter. The Philistines just want him gone.
Achish summoned David and said to him, "As the Lord lives, you are an honest man, and I would like to have you serve in my forces. For I have found no fault with you from the day you joined me until now. But you are not acceptable to the other lords. So go back in peace and do nothing to displease the Philistine lords." David, however, said to Achish, "But what have I done? What fault have you found in your servant from the day I appeared before you to this day, that I should not go and fight against the enemies of my lord the king?"
So Achish says, "Go back." He says, I like you, but no one else likes you. Everyone else hates you, David. They don't trust you.
But that seems to be the easy way out for David.
Oh, of course it seems to be the
I
easy
don't know
way.
why he would do that.
Of course it seems to be the easy way
Yeah.
out. And it seems as though David wanted to make sure that you and I know this, that he had nothing to do with this. He does not seem to Yeah, but look what he says. Look what he says to him. Right? I haven't done anything wrong. Why are you sending me away? I seem to have been pretty good for you. Right?
We've been able to kind of know him for a long
Fine, but he actually argues. David actually doesn't just go, okay, thank you. I'll go back. He doesn't. He says back to him, I think I've done everything you've asked me to do. Right? What have I done? So here's what he says.
Achish replied to David, I know you are as acceptable to me as an angel of God, but the Philistine officers have decided that you must not march out with us to the battle. So rise early in the morning, you and your Lord's servants who came with you, rise early in the morning and leave as soon as it is light.
So get out, leave. You're not part of this fight. Go home. And you leave early, which seems to be almost something that David would have said, not necessarily anybody else. Because the point of this is that David can be nowhere near this battle when it happens. Can't be anywhere near this battle.
Accordingly, David and his men rose up early in the morning to leave, to return to the land of the Philistines, while the Philistines marched up to Jezreel.
So David's not anywhere near the battle when it happens. Really important for the story. Very important for David. Because if David is anywhere near the battle, then he is a traitor. Then he has killed Saul. Then he has worked with the enemies of the Israelites to kill. And this is really important because the next story we have is maybe it really happened, but this next chapter only exists for one purpose. Chapter 30 of Samuel exists only for one purpose, which is to give David an alibi. David's alibi is this scene that happens here, which is that David was nowhere near there. And that's what this is. And this is kind of this is what we'll finish up with today. The last part.
By the time David and his men arrived in Ziklag on the third day, the Amalekites had made a raid into the Negev and against Ziklag. They had stormed Ziklag and burned it down. They had taken the women in it captive, lowborn and highborn alike. They did not kill any, but carried them off and went their way. When David and his men came to the town and found it burned down, and their wives and sons and daughters taken captive, David and the troops with him broke into tears until they had no strength left for weeping.
So he goes back home, right? He goes back home to Ziklag, which again, let me just share for a quick second. Nowhere near there. So they were all up here, and now they went back down to Ziklag, down here, down in the Philistine Judah border. So the Amalekites are the ones who attacked there. So remember, the Amalekites crossed over through the desert and attacked them. There's only one problem. There weren't supposed to be any more Amalekites left. King Agag was supposed to be the last Amalekite left. And remember, that's how Saul got in trouble, by preserving these guys. So now all of a sudden, the Amalekites could come in and raided the Negev and taken this guy away. So what happened? How are there so many Amalekites all of a sudden that there's enough to make a raid? The Amalekites keep popping up, always almost as a foil to do the exact thing that we need them to do exactly at the right time, which seems to be a little too convenient. And this isn't the last time they're going to pop up. But here they were attacking Ziklag, didn't kill anybody, but took everybody hostage, which also seems a little strange. So the story seems a little strange in that this isn't people that you normally would expect to be on a raid, because they're not supposed to be there anymore. The fact that they don't kill anybody but take everybody hostage seems a little suspicious, because somebody usually dies.
But isn't that because the men were already gone fighting?
Maybe, I guess, if every man is gone, maybe. Is there no old man left? They just came in and took everybody and say, hey, we're all going away. Maybe, but some people are dying. It's pretty hard to go to war without killing anybody. The whole thing seems kind of a little weird. in that it seems a little too convenient that the Amalekites are here, our enemies, our natural enemies, our immortal enemies, eternal enemies, are doing exactly what we need them to do at this moment. David needs them essentially to get out of being anywhere near the Philistines.
So did they want to be with the Israelites better than they wanted to be with the Philistines?
Who, the Amalekites? Oh, you could, there's a lot of reasons. The problem is they were all supposed to be dead. I mean, it just seems a little strange. So they take everybody hostage. You can kill anybody, took everybody hostage, right? And now everyone's sad. Look what happened.
David's 2 wives had been taken captive, Ahinoam of Jezreel and Abigail, wife of Nabal from Carmel. David was in great danger, for the troops threatened to stone him, for all the troops were embittered on account of their sons and daughters. But David sought strength in the Lord his God. David said to the priest Abiathar of Ahimelech, "Bring the ephod up to me." When Abiathar brought up the ephod to David, David inquired of the Lord, "Shall I pursue those raiders? Will I overtake them?" And he answered him, "Pursue, for you shall overtake and you shall rescue."
Wow. So David does what Saul can't do,
All the orders.
but he also talks to God. God answers him. Now he uses the ephod, which I'm not exactly sure how he'd use the ephod, but that's the holy thing that he has. And Abiathar is his, remember, that's his priest. That's the only priest that survived that wiped out group at Nob that were killed by Saul. Ephod is something that attached to the apron of the priests. It was something, we don't know exactly what, but it could be used to communicate with God. And the answers come through. So, some people said it had the Urim and Tumim in it. There was some kind of divine 8-ball in that thing, whatever, who knows? Whatever it was, it shakes, it speaks, whatever it does. It's some way of communicating with God. And David gets the answer he
The
wants
first cell phone.
directly to God.
That's a good
Is
one.
there only one ephod that exists?
Is there only one ephod? It doesn't seem that there's only one ephod. Sometimes it says,
Aaron had the first one though, right, Rabbi?
what?
Aaron had the first one.
Yeah. But sometimes it says ha ephod, which is what it says here. And sometimes it says just ephod. Look, we don't know what it looked like. We don't know exactly how many of them there were, whether every priest would every high priest would get his own. Abiathar is not the high priest at this point. He's David's priest. So did Saul's priest have an ephod? I mean, I would think so. I wouldn't think that this is the only ephod, but it's possible. It's David's ephod and under his control. And again, he says to God, can I do this? Can I pursue them? Will I be victorious? And his answer, of course, is the affirmative. You're good. You're good to go.
So David and the 600 men with him set out, and they came to the Wadi Besor, where a halt was made by those who were to be left behind. David continued the pursuit with 400 men. 200 men had halted, too faint to cross the Wadi Besor. They came upon an Egyptian in the open country and brought him to David. They gave him food to eat and water to drink. He was also given a piece of pressed fig cake and 2 cakes of raisins. He ate and regained his strength, for he had eaten no food and drunk no water for 3 days and 3 nights. Then David asked him, "To whom do you belong and where are you from?" "I am an Egyptian boy," he answered, "the slave of an Amalekite. My master abandoned me when I fell ill 3 days ago."
So they find an Egyptian boy, slave, whatever, that's been left behind. And they're going to get their intel from this guy, right? Where do the Amalekites go? Now, a couple things. This is in the desert. So food and supplies are really important. Similarly, this kid would have been left to die. See what seems to be, right? He fell ill and my master abandoned me. It's such a hard journey that 200 of David's troops can't even go. They're too tired. They have to get left behind. So only part of the force is even able to continue on this journey, this battle. So this was not an easy thing to do. It seems like a really detailed situation here. It doesn't just tell us that they met an Egyptian boy who told them what was going on. It tells us what they fed them. And they, there's this whole scene of, restoring this kid to strength before they could talk to him. But it seems all of these details seem really, really important.
We had raided the Negev of the Kerethites and the Negev of Judah and the Negev of Caleb. We also burned down Ziklag. And David said to him, "Can you lead me down to that band?" He replied, "Swear to me by God that you will not kill me or deliver me into my master's hands, and I will lead you down to that band." So the guy gave him the intel, told him, yeah, this, I was part of this force that went in and we raided the Negev and we raided, some of Judah stuff and some of Caleb, which seems to be almost different than Judah. Or at least he identifies it as a part of the Negev that is controlled by Caleb's people, which I read about. That was Nabal. That was Abigail's husband, was from Caleb. And he says, "Oh yeah, we burned down Ziklag too," which is his town. So now he knows that's him. And he says, "Look, I'll help you. Don't kill me and don't turn me back over to these guys."
So were his two wives captive at this point?
Yeah, that's what it said. They took them. He took them. So specifically, so what do?
So he led him down, and there they were, scattered all over the ground, eating and drinking and making merry because of all the vast spoil they had taken from the land of the Philistines and from the land of Judah. David attacked them from before dawn until the evening of the next day. None of them escaped, except 400 young men who mounted camels and got away. David rescued everything the Amalekites had taken. David also rescued his two wives.
So the Amalekites had done these raids, which again, we know that these desert raiders would occasionally cross over and attack the farms and the places in Judah after they had their harvest, after they'd sheared their sheep. These raiders would come in and attack them and steal their stuff. Look, it seems the Philistines have to deal with them too, right? It's not just Israel and Judah. It's the Philistines. It says they took stuff from the Philistines. So everything the Amalekites had taken on this raid, and again, we're assuming these are like Arab raiders. These are guys like Arab nomads that are coming across, and that's what they seem to be like. They plunder stuff. Now David winds up with all of it because he plundered it from them. So everything that they had taken, he now has taken. So he gets his wives back, plus he gets everything else that they had taken from everybody else. So David's now wound up with even more stuff. This is important for the story. Because believe it or not, the focus isn't on what Marcia said, which is, he got his wives back. That should be it, right? That should be the main concern here. Also, of course, that's not really the main concern. The main concern is to get him as far away from the Philistine battle that was happening at the exact same time. So he's nowhere near the Philistine battle. He's spending days out here, out in the desert around the Dead Sea.
Where's his son Jonathan?
Oh, he's back up with David, with Saul, right?
Okay, so
He's being killed.
Yeah.
We'll get to that. Don't worry. Not today. Not today. So here's the sad part here.
David took, nothing of theirs was missing, young or old, sons or daughters, spoil or anything else that had been carried off. David recovered everything. David took all the flocks and herds, which the troops ahead of the other livestock, and they declared, "This is David's spoil." When David reached the 200 men who were too faint to follow David and who had been left at the Wadi Besor, they came out to welcome David and the troops with him. David came forward with the troops and greeted them.
So what do you think is going to happen now? What do you think is the unresolved issue right here at this point?
They don't want to share.
Whether the troops who didn't take part in this battle get any of this loot.
Rosemary is correct. Rosemary is correct. That the actual point of this story now shifts from David's alibi, David getting his wives back, David getting everything back, everything. They didn't lose anything. And they wound up with even more. The story is now going to shift to this now discussion of what happens.
But all the mean and churlish fellows among the men who had accompanied David spoke up. "Since they did not accompany us, we will not give them any of the spoil that we seized, except that each may take his wife and children and go." David, however, spoke up. "You must not do that, my brothers, in view of what the Lord has granted us, guarding us and delivering into our hands the band that attacked us. How could anyone agree with you in this matter? The share of those who remain with the baggage shall be the same as the share of those who go down to battle. They shall share alike."
So David's decision is no, everybody gets a piece of the action. Everybody gets it. So it's not going to make the people who risk their lives in battle feel very happy. Two-thirds of the people, who've gotten it. Now everybody gets it. Yes, but they didn't risk their lives. And so that's where they're saying they shouldn't be able to. That was their argument. By letting them stay? Yeah. But the argument is that you don't take people who are too weak into battle because it hurts your whole your whole situation. So that's his argument.
So from that day on, it was made a fixed rule for Israel, continuing to the present day. When David reached Ziklag, he sent some of the spoil to the elders of Judah and to his friends, saying, "This is a present for you from our spoil of the enemies of the Lord."
Yeah, so David not only gave back the stuff to the people who lost their stuff, not only did he give people who didn't even fight in battle some of the stuff, he sent some of the stuff to other people in Judah and to his friends, which is that you also get a taste of this. But I will tell you that as much as this is going into battle, there is a level to this that honestly feels like the mafia and not like a battle. Because when he says, "I sent some stuff back to the people of Judah, to the elders of Judah, and to his friends," it sounds a lot like somebody taking care of the senior people in the syndicate. It does not seem just like this is politics or.
I wonder if any anthropologists have studied the mafia as a raiding culture.
I don't know. That's
Very interesting.
This is what in our times, this is the closest that we can compare it to. And there's an actual accounting of it. Uh-huh.
He sent the spoil to the elders in Bethel, Ramoth Negev, and Yatir, in Aroer, Sifmot, and Eshtemoa, in Rakal, in the towns of the Jerahmeelites, and in the towns of the Kenites, in Hormah, Bor Ashan, and Athak, and to those in Hebron, all the places where David and his men had roamed.
Yep. So that is David's payback to the people. Now we're going to finish here because we're not going to read about this next part, which is the last chapter of Samuel. Samuel 1, not Samuel 2. But this last chapter is the battle, the final battle, Saul's final battle.
Didn't back to your community. You want to build your community again with trust and honor and love.
Yeah, but look who he pays off first. He pays off his own tribe. Those people are all in the tribe of Judah. Those were the elders of Judah. Of course, you take care of your family first, because what you're saying to your family is what's about to happen is the big payday. The big payday is about to happen when I become king.
Yeah, but he knew that all along, right? He knew he was going to become king. Then he was young, right?
Uh-huh.
Don't worry, there's more with it.
So what's going to happen? What's going to happen next week? Or excuse me, we're off next week. But the week after, we're going to read the battle of Gilboa, and we're going to read the first chapter of the end chapter of this, which goes with the first chapter of Samuel 2, which is what happens when power comes to David. Now, remember, originally in the Jewish sections of the Bible, there was not a break between Samuel 1 and Samuel 2. It was one book of Samuel. It was only later on when Christian scholars broke it up that they decided to break it up here, where they did. In many ways, I would have put, and this is why one of the reasons why we're doing it, we're going to read the last chapter with that. Now, technically, it kind of goes back to what we read today, which is the setup with the witch of Endor. But the reality is that the battle that we're going to read, Saul's last stand, if you will, very much is like something that you'd read in a Western or in a final gangland shootout, which is what we're going to read. So again, it seems as though the stories were documented by people who lived very close to the events. The details in the story seem hyper realistic, even when they might have been created in order to set up that realism, telling us how many raisin cakes the guy in the desert got, that Egyptian boy in the desert, seems to be, again, written by somebody who really wants to make you be there and either was there or knew something about what happened. These elements don't seem to be fabricated, even if they're used context or with a certain intended purpose. There definitely seems to be some details here that are very, very realistic. So I don't know. I believe it happened. That's my take on it. Everybody, we'll see you in a couple of weeks, but definitely come here Friday night for services, and we'll see you in person.
There's class tomorrow, right, Rabbi?
Class tomorrow night, Wednesday night. Thanks, everybody.
The Rebbe thing.